Well, 5 days from now, the jolly fat man with a red nose will be making his annual visit to my house. Ed shows up whether he's invited or not.
When it comes to savage moments on late-night TV, Johnny Carson wore the crown without question. The man had a razor-sharp wit and a comeback for just about anything, whether it was a bold guest, an awkward situation, or even his own co-hosts. Carson didn't just host The Tonight Show. He turned it into a stage where sarcasm, clever digs, and playful jabs ruled the night. And as you'll soon see, he wasn't the only one bringing the heat. Stick around as we dive into the most savage, jaw-dropping moments that defined Johnny Carson's legendary run. 1. George Burns and the cigarette setup that had everyone in stitches.
What number of cigar is this for you today now?
This is my 10th or 11th cigar. I smoke between 15 and 20 cigars a day.
George was famous for always having a cigar in his hand. It was basically his trademark. That cigar was as much a part of his persona as his thick glasses and that distinctive gravelly voice that had entertained audiences for generations. So naturally, when George settled into his chair that night, the conversation drifted toward his smoking habit. Johnny, always the perfect interviewer, knew this was fertile ground for comedy gold. He asked George about those cigars, and what came next was pure entertainment magic. George casually mentioned that he smoked somewhere between 10 and 15 cigars every single day. Let that sink in for a second. This man was in his 90s, puffing away like a chimney, and still sharp as a tack. The audience was already chuckling at the sheer audacity of it. Here was a guy who had lived through almost the entire 20th century, and he was still doing exactly what he wanted without apology. But George wasn't done, not by a long shot. He started talking about what would happen if he ever found himself in a hold-up situation. Now, most people might find this topic a bit dark or uncomfortable, but not George Burns. The way he told it, with that perfect deadpan delivery that only George Burns could pull off, transformed a potentially scary scenario into something absolutely hilarious. What made this moment so incredibly special wasn't just the joke itself. It was watching two absolute masters of comedy playing off each other like they had been doing it forever. Johnny knew exactly when to react, when to laugh, and when to just let George work his magic. He would lean back in his chair, that famous smile spreading across his face, and you could tell he was genuinely enjoying every second. The timing was absolutely perfect. George had spent decades, literally decades, perfecting his craft. He had started in vaudeville, worked in radio, conquered television, and made classic movies. By the time he sat on Johnny's couch at 93, he had forgotten more about comedy than most people would ever learn. But he hadn't forgotten the fundamentals: timing, delivery, and knowing your audience. George Burns proved that night that age is really just a number when you've got the gift of comedy running through your veins. He wasn't trying to be young or hip or relevant. He was just being himself. A guy who loved cigars, loved making people laugh, and wasn't about to stop doing either one just because he'd hit his 90s. George Burns lived to be 100 years old, by the way, passing away in 1996. He kept performing almost until the end, proving that his comedy about longevity and his unhealthy habits wasn't just funny. It was oddly prophetic. That appearance on The Tonight Show at 93 was one of many reminders that George Burns was truly one of a kind. 2. Robin Williams, Unleashed.
Oh, San Francisco, where God Save the Queen has a different meaning. That's a wonderful city. The only place in the world to have real drag races. Two men going, "What are you wearing? I don't know what are you wearing."
If you want to talk about controlled chaos on The Tonight Show, we have to talk about Robin Williams. Whenever Robin walked onto that set, you knew something absolutely wild was about to happen. The man couldn't sit still, literally. He was like a tornado of energy and humor wrapped up in one human being, and watching him perform was like watching lightning in a bottle. From the moment Robin appeared, the energy in the studio would shift. The audience would perk up, sensing that they were about to witness something special. And Robin never disappointed. He would bound onto the stage with this manic energy that was both infectious and slightly overwhelming. Before he even sat down, he would already be cracking jokes, doing voices, and interacting with the audience in ways that nobody expected. Robin would show up and immediately launch into a series of characters, voices, and impressions that would leave everyone gasping for air from laughing so hard. 1 minute, he would be doing a spot-on impression of a famous actor, maybe Jack Nicholson or Katharine Hepburn, complete with perfect vocal inflections and mannerisms. The next second, he would transform into some completely made-up character that somehow made perfect sense in the moment, like a Russian ballet dancer with a Brooklyn accent or a British game show host who'd lost his mind. The range was absolutely staggering. Robin could switch between characters in milliseconds, often mid-sentence. He would start a thought as himself, become someone else halfway through, and finish as a third completely different person. And somehow it all flowed together in this brilliant stream of consciousness that felt both random and purposeful at the same time. You would see Johnny wiping tears from his eyes, trying to compose himself while Robin bounced around the set like he had had 12 cups of coffee. Sometimes Johnny would laugh so hard he'd have to turn away from the camera. Other times, he would just sit there with this look of amazed disbelief on his face, like he couldn't quite believe what he was witnessing. And in those moments, Johnny became the audience's surrogate. We were all right there with him, blown away by Robin's talent. The amazing thing about Robin was that it never felt rehearsed, even though he was obviously incredibly skilled and experienced. Every appearance felt fresh, spontaneous, and absolutely electric. He would riff on current events, spinning them into elaborate comedy routines on the fly. He would pick up on something Johnny said and turn it into a 5-minute improvised sketch. He would notice something in the studio, a camera, a prop, someone in the audience, and incorporate it into his act seamlessly. Robin's brain moved faster than most people could keep up with, and watching him perform was like watching a high-wire act without a net. You never knew where he was going next, and you got the sense that sometimes he didn't know either. He'd start down one path, see something more interesting, and veer off in a completely new direction, dragging the audience along with him on this wild ride. His physical comedy was just as impressive as his verbal skills. Robin would leap out of his chair, sprawl across Johnny's desk, interact with props, and use every inch of the stage. He would make faces that seemed physically impossible, contort his body in ridiculous ways, and use gestures that added whole layers of meaning to his words. Watching Robin Williams perform wasn't just about listening. You had to watch every movement because the physical comedy was just as rich as the verbal. 3. Betty White, the sweet grandmother who dropped bombs.
We loved it.
Did you really?
Oh, we loved it. We were giving a wife-swapping party and nobody would come.
Betty White was television royalty long before The Tonight Show, and whenever she appeared with Johnny, you knew you were in for a treat. She had this incredible ability to look like everybody's sweet grandmother while delivering lines that would make a sailor blush. Betty would sit on that couch looking absolutely innocent, with her perfect smile and lovely demeanor. Johnny would ask her a question, and she would respond with something so unexpectedly sassy or risque that the audience would gasp before erupting into laughter. The contrast between her wholesome appearance and her sharp wit was comedy gold. What made Betty's appearances so special was the element of surprise. She'd lull you into a false sense of security, making you think she was going to give some nice, safe answer. Then, boom, she would hit you with a zinger that left everyone stunned. Johnny loved it. You could see the delight in his eyes whenever Betty would drop one of her verbal bombs. The timing of her delivery was impeccable. Betty understood that the shock value came from the contrast, and she played it perfectly every single time. She never tried too hard or telegraphed her jokes. She just casually mentioned something outrageous, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Audiences adored Betty because she broke the mold of what people expected from actresses of her generation. She proved that you could be classy and edgy at the same time. Her appearances on The Tonight Show became must-see television because nobody knew what she was going to say next. Even Johnny, who had seen it all, would sometimes seem genuinely surprised by her comments. Betty White showed everyone that comedy doesn't have to be loud or aggressive to be effective. Sometimes the most savage moments come from the people you least expect, delivered with a smile and perfect comic timing. 4. Madeline Kahn's phobia. That left everyone speechless.
I'll tell you what leapt to my mind. You know, I do not like balls coming toward me.
Madeline Kahn was a brilliant actress and comedian who brought something special to every appearance she made. One particular visit to The Tonight Show became legendary for all the right reasons, and it started with a simple question about fears and phobias. Johnny, doing what he did best, was having a casual conversation with Madeline about things that scared her. It seemed like innocent small talk, the kind of banter that filled thousands of Tonight Show episodes. But Madeline's answer took everyone completely by surprise. She mentioned with perfect sincerity that she didn't like balls coming toward her. The moment those words left her mouth, you could feel the energy in the studio shift. The audience started to laugh, picking up on the unintended double meaning immediately. Now, Johnny Carson was a master of the well-timed comeback. He had this incredible ability to find humor in unexpected places without being mean-spirited. So without missing a beat, he delivered what might be one of his most memorable lines ever. He suggested that maybe her condition should be called testophobia. The place absolutely erupted. The audience roared with laughter. Madeline started laughing, and even the band was cracking up. It was one of those perfect television moments where everything aligned. The setup, the delivery, and the reaction all came together beautifully. What made this exchange so memorable wasn't just the joke itself. It was the way Johnny delivered it with such casual confidence, like he had just thought of it on the spot. And knowing Johnny's quick wit, he probably had. Madeline was a good sport about the whole thing, laughing along and showing that she appreciated the humor in the situation. This moment perfectly captured what made Johnny special. He could find comedy in unexpected places, deliver it with perfect timing, and do it all without being offensive or crossing the line. It was cheeky, it was funny, and it became one of those clips that people would reference for decades to come. 5. Don Rickles stuns Frank Sinatra.
I walked by the table and I said, "How are you, Don? Nice to see you." He said, "Can't you see I'm eating, Frank? What are you doing?"
Don Rickles was known as Mr. Warmth for his hilariously insulting comedy style, and he was a regular presence on The Tonight Show. But one particular story he shared with Johnny became the stuff of absolute legend because it involved pranking one of the biggest, most powerful stars in the world, Frank Sinatra. Now, you have to understand the context here. Frank Sinatra wasn't just famous, he was untouchable. This was a man who commanded respect and, frankly, fear wherever he went. People didn't mess with Frank Sinatra, except, apparently, for Don Rickles. Here's how the whole thing went down, and it's absolutely brilliant. Don was at a restaurant one evening with a young woman he was trying to impress. This was a big deal for him. He wanted to look good, seem important, and make this date memorable. So he came up with what seemed like a foolproof plan. Don knew that Frank Sinatra happened to be at the same restaurant that night, so he reached out and asked Frank for a favor. The setup was simple. Don asked if Frank could casually walk by his table and say hello, just to make Don look connected and important in front of his date. It was supposed to be a friendly gesture, a little moment that would make Don seem like a big shot who knew Frank Sinatra personally. Frank, being a good sport, agreed to do it. The plan was set. Everything was arranged. Frank would stroll by, say a quick hello to Don, maybe exchange a few pleasant words, and then move on. Don would look like $1,000,000 in front of his date, and everyone would be happy. But this was Don Rickles we're talking about. The man who made a career out of insulting people couldn't just let it play out as planned. So when Frank Sinatra actually walked over to the table, being friendly and playing along with the arrangement they'd made, Don looked up at him and completely flipped the script. Instead of being grateful or gracious, Don actually shouted at Frank, asking him if he couldn't see that he was busy. He told Frank to leave them alone, acting annoyed that Sinatra had the audacity to interrupt his date. Can you imagine? Frank Sinatra, one of the most powerful men in entertainment, getting yelled at and dismissed by Don Rickles in front of a restaurant full of people. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. The genius of the moment was watching Frank's reaction, at least as Don told it. Here was a man who commanded respect wherever he went, someone you didn't mess with under any circumstances, and Don Rickles had just completely thrown him off balance. According to Don, you could see the surprise register on Frank's face. This mixture of shock, confusion, and then, thankfully, amusement as he realized he'd been had by the master of insult comedy. Frank, to his credit, got the joke. He started laughing, realizing that Don had set him up, and then turned the tables completely. It took a special kind of person to pull that off with Frank Sinatra, and Don Rickles was definitely that special kind of person. When Frank told this story on The Tonight Show, the audience went absolutely wild. They loved hearing about this playful dynamic between two legends, and the fact that Don had the guts to not just surprise Frank Sinatra, but to actively insult him after asking him for a favor, made it all the more entertaining. It showed that in comedy, sometimes the best moments come when you throw out the script and go for broke. Johnny was loving every second of the story. He was laughing so hard he could barely keep it together. And this was saying something because Don Rickles was one of the few people who could actually leave Johnny Carson speechless. Johnny, who always had a quick comeback for everything, would sometimes just sit there stunned by the things Don would say and do. Don had this unique ability to push boundaries that nobody else could touch. He would insult Johnny, insult the guests, insult the audience, and somehow make everyone love him for it. And Johnny, who had dealt with thousands of comedians over the years, seemed genuinely delighted and occasionally shocked by what Don would come up with. 6. Jonathan Winters.
I was always disturbed because I didn't know where I was. And unless you're an officer, you see, you're not clued in. And you're not given the top papers, which I felt I should have had at least 1 or 2 papers.
If you want to talk about comedic genius, you have to mention Jonathan Winters. The man was in a league of his own when it came to improvisation and off-the-wall humor. Whenever Jonathan appeared on The Tonight Show, you knew you were about to witness something truly special. What made Jonathan so remarkable was how effortlessly funny he was. He didn't need elaborate setups or carefully scripted jokes. He could just start talking, and somehow everything that came out of his mouth was hilarious. His mind worked in ways that seemed completely unique, making connections that nobody else would think of. Jonathan would launch into these improvised characters and scenarios that seemed to come from nowhere. 1 second, he would be himself. The next, he would transform into some completely random person with a full backstory and personality. And it all felt natural, like he was just channeling these characters that lived inside his head. His responses to Johnny's questions were often savage in their own way, not mean or cutting, but unexpectedly sharp and always funny. He had this way of looking at the world from a slightly tilted angle, finding humor in places other people wouldn't think to look. The audience was always completely captivated by Jonathan's performances. You could see them leaning forward in their seats, not wanting to miss a single word. Even Johnny, who'd interviewed thousands of guests over the years, would seem genuinely amazed by what Jonathan would come up with on the spot. What separated Jonathan from other comedians was his fearlessness. He wasn't afraid to go weird, to take risks, or to try something that might not work. But somehow it always worked. His instincts were so sharp and his talent so immense that he could make anything funny. Watching Jonathan Winters on The Tonight Show was like watching a jazz musician improvise a solo. You knew you were seeing something that could never be exactly replicated. Each appearance was its own unique piece of comedy art, and people treasured these moments because they understood they were watching a true master at work. 7. Johnny Carson.
Not mean my life is going bad. Do you understand that at all? He just wants a pig.
Finally, we have to talk about Johnny Carson himself. While he was known for being a gracious host who made his guests look good, Johnny could also be absolutely savage when the moment called for it. His quick wit and perfect timing made him dangerous in the best possible way. There was one moment where someone on the show corrected Johnny about something during the broadcast. Now, most hosts might let it slide or awkwardly move on, but not Johnny. He looked directly at the person and said something along the lines of, "So you just corrected me on national television?" The delivery was perfect. You couldn't tell if he was genuinely annoyed or playing it up for laughs, and that ambiguity made it even funnier. Then there were the famous rumors about some of his more risque comments. One involved Zsa Zsa Gabor and a joke about petting her cat that became legendary in late-night television lore. The story goes that Johnny made a comment suggesting he would pet Zsa Zsa if she moved her cat, creating one of those double-meaning moments that Johnny was so famous for. Another rumored moment involved Dolly Parton, where Johnny allegedly made a comment about what he would pay to be in a certain position regarding her famous figure. Whether these stories are exactly as remembered or have been embellished over time doesn't really matter. They've become part of the Johnny Carson legend because they perfectly capture his brand of cheeky, boundary-pushing humor. What made Johnny's savage moments so effective was that they never felt mean-spirited. He had this incredible ability to push the envelope without being offensive. He would say something cheeky or make a double entendre, and you'd laugh because of the cleverness of it, not because it was cruel. Johnny also knew how to read a room better than anyone. He understood when he could push a joke further and when to pull back. He could make suggestive comments that would have gotten anyone else in trouble, but because of his delivery and his relationship with the audience, he could get away with it. His facial expressions were comedy gold too. Sometimes Johnny didn't even need to say anything. He would just give the camera a look and you'd know exactly what he was thinking. The raised eyebrow, the knowing smile, the perfectly timed pause. These were all part of his arsenal of comedic weapons. Johnny Carson wasn't just good at hosting a talk show, he was the gold standard that everyone else tried to match. His savage moments weren't about tearing people down, they were about creating entertaining television that made people laugh. He proved night after night that quick wit and good timing could create magic.